Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first Congress of the Latin American Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. My name is Jorge Maldonado, the current president of the association, and want to welcome all of you and invite to participate in all of the activities that we will have around these 2 days of academic and social agenda. We are ready to start, so we will start with a keynote speech by Juan Pablo, and I want to invite Nathaly Rivera, who is going to be the chair of the session. Thank you very much.
Hello, welcome everyone. So I have the pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the Congress. He is a professor of economics at the University of London, a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics, and a research associate at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. His main research interests are in the fields of development economics, natural resources, and environmental economics. His works has been published in prestigious outlets such as AEJ, Economic Policy, Journal of Development Economics, the Economic Journal, and recently Econometrica. On a personal note, I have to say that my early passion for the economics of extractive industries was truly inspired by his amazing work on the local effects of the Yanacocha gold mine in Peru. So, Juan Pablo Ruth, thank you so much for accepting this invitation, for your contribution to the field, and please, welcome to the stage. The floor is yours.
Timer on. Hi, thanks Nathaly and Jorge for the invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And also, thanks all of you for being here in the first inaugural LAERE conference. So without further ado, and due to time constraints, I'm going to get started. I'm going to talk today about natural resource windfalls and how that can contribute to local economic development. And I'm going to try to focus on the region of interest here. I'm going to try to talk as much as possible about Latin America. And I think the starting point to frame this presentation is to think about what the energy transition is going to bring. And what it's going to bring, it's basically an increased reliance on minerals. So we already rely on fossil fuels. And the idea is that as we move to wind, solar, the development of battery and storage, a lot of new minerals and a lot of new resources will be fundamental for that transition, for that technological and environmental transition to be able to happen. So here, clearly, it's not very clear, but you can see in the first column, you have wind. In the second, you have solar, photovoltaic, and then you have a storage. And you can see on the different rows, you have a lot of new materials, so a lot of minerals that are being used. Some of them are not new. You see copper, for example, will still be feeding every energy sector or any technology. But you have news like lithium or nickel that are being used for these new technologies. So this is an opportunity for Latin America. Some of these minerals we are already producing in the region, but if you see the little, the little dots here, this is the potential that the region has in terms of share of resources in different minerals around the world, whether it's silver, lithium, copper, etc. Right? And at the bottom you can see a little map of the region where all the potential critical minerals, so these minerals that are key for the energy transition, whether they are located. And that includes like Brazil has like these rare earth minerals that gain a lot of attention recently with respect to the US and Ukraine. So there's a lot of potential that, that the region can try to exploit in terms of natural resources. So one question, and that's related to the paper that Nathaly mentioned when I started working on natural resources, is how can we try to make these resources useful for economic development or for regional economic development, right? So that's a question. How can countries with these minerals exploit them in a way that supports the pathway of economic development? There are well-known challenges for that, right? Of course, you all have heard of the natural resource curves and all those more macro type of approaches to the question of resources. But there's also a lot of very micro and very regional relevant questions that have not been fully addressed. The first one is it's a very old idea coming from Hirschman in the 50s that extractives in low-income countries usually operate as an enclave. And what that means is that they're like an island in the middle of a region that has no economic relationship with that activity, right? You can think of multinationals bringing in capital, bringing in human capital from elsewhere, producing, exporting everything as raw material, and then the extraction happened, and there was no visible benefit for the region where the mines are located. So there is some evidence that linkages can help, and that's the paper that Nathaly mentioned in Peru. But with China currently dominating most of the processing of these minerals anyway, there's very little for local economies to do. So it's not impossible, but the scope is limited. There's also a lot of negative impacts, negative externalities from these extractive industries on the environment and on local communities. So again, I have worked with Fernando Aragon. We have worked on the gold industry in Ghana and how that clashes with local farmers, traditional household farms that are being exposed to all the pollution generated by those mines, and the productivity goes down. There's a very nice recent paper looking at lithium in Antofagasta in Chile, and how that is depriving local communities from very valuable water resources, and then agricultural activity is going down. And then, in general, you will see, if you go to the environmental justice website, you will see in Latin America there's like 300 ongoing mining conflicts, right? Not all of them are violent conflicts, but there are still litigations, there's strikes, there's confrontations, and so on. And then the other thing that may matter for local economic development, and may matter here in Colombia that has an important coal mining industry, is that this transition out of coal or fossil fuels will displace a lot of people. And again, part of that transition, for the transition to be fair or to be just, you need to address these short and long-term costs that people whose livelihoods depend on those industries are facing. And again, even in places like the UK, where you have a social security and a present state and a lot of programs ongoing, coal miners that were displaced, I mean, they never recovered, whether in employment or earnings or anything like that. And there's similar evidence from Colombia as well, more recent. So here what I'm trying to say is that, okay, so all these economic linkages are hard to get. So is there any other way in which countries can benefit from having access to these resources? And one clear way would be the redistribution of the resources, of the rents that are generated by this industry in the form of royalties or taxes that are paid to governments. So there's not a lot of evidence. There's some evidence of the potential role that the public sector has in channeling these rents towards local communities and towards regional economies. There's also evidence that sometimes it may not work. There's evidence of corruption, on waste, and how that can prevent the collection and spending of those rents. There's evidence here, very good evidence here, including some of you in the audience have generated evidence here for Colombia. And the interesting thing is that there's very different legal frameworks around Latin America. Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Peru, they all have different laws and different tweaks to those laws that try to provide rents to the regional governments. But they are mostly focusing on the resource, on the areas where the resources are located. So in the remainder of the talk, this is how I want to frame the question. I'm going to talk about a specific example and the case of the canon law in Peru. And this is joint work with Antonella Bancalari, also Latin American, she's from Peru, she's at the IFS. And what we do is we try to understand to what extent this redistribution of rents that are generated by extractive activity can promote, trigger, or sustain a process of local economic development. Of course, this generates an empirical problem because, of course, local economies may benefit or may be affected negatively by the extractive industries themselves, right? If I'm in a town near a mine, I might sell to the mine, so that's good, or I might receive pollution, or I might be displaced from my land, and that's bad, right? So what we're going to try to do here is try to understand how this law has actually affected areas that are not extractive. And this is because of a peculiarity that has the Peruvian law, which is a redistribution of the rents coming from extractive activities into areas that have no extractive activity at all. So the interesting thing is this is not just giving unconditional cash transfers to governments. This is conditioned, right? Governments, basically they will receive money, the poorer they are, they will receive more, but also they are constraining how they can spend the money. They need to spend the money trying to close the infrastructure gaps that exist between these backward areas and more modern areas around the country. So the idea is not just you get money, it's you have to spend it in a specific way associated to investments and capital expenditures. So that's why these transfers to local governments will affect both the size and the composition of expenditures. And this is what we're going to exploit to try to understand how that shapes local economies. So the study is the resource windfalls coming from Peruvian, accrued by Peruvian municipalities between 2006 and 2018. And we start in 2006 because even though the canon law existed before, only in 2006 they started redistributing to these non-extractive areas. We will have a lot of data, and I will talk through that later. We have administrative records for the municipalities and survey data for more than 700,000 individuals. And what we're going to do is we're going to use these natural resource tax revenues set by the canon law as in an instrumental variable approach to instrument for the transfer, the intergovernmental transfers. The important thing is that while the resources are generated by the extractive municipalities, in a way I will show later, non-extractive municipalities are benefiting. So everything we're going to identify here will come from the resource transfer and not from the extractive activities per se. So there's other studies that have looked at the Peruvian canon. We are the first in using so much granularity in exploiting this feature of the law that redistributes to non-mining districts and in putting together so many data sets that allows us to provide a rich description of what's going on. So this links to, as economists, a question that we all care about, I hope, which is to what extent this type of redistribution to local governments can stimulate economic activity, right? So I come from Argentina, and you may know that we every time transfers to local governments happen, they're not triggering any economic activity in the region, right? But maybe here it's different, and this is what we're going to explore. So how can these transfers generate positive multiplier effects or positive economic effects in local economies? Well, it could be through investments, which is what the law intends to do. It could be through the multiplier itself, which is you have an expenditure that goes to wages and investments. Those investments generates more economic activity, and that multiplies and generates rewards or benefits to economic activities that are not directly linked to the municipal activity. But of course, what can happen is that maybe the government is just hiring people, and that's why I mentioned Argentina. Some provinces have like 2/3 of public employment, 2/3 of formal employment is public, right? So there's that overpaid public sector may actually decrease aggregate output, may deter entrepreneurship, may deter investments. And at the same time, it will just make too expensive the availability of labor, right? So a firm that wants to produce needs to pay very high wages in order to compete with the public sector. So there's a lot of papers that show that this happens. So I have one that we use cross-sectional data from different countries, including countries in Latin America. But there's other papers in Colombia, like the Albrecht et al., or in Brazil, like Cavalcanti and Santos, that show that these things are real and deter public enterprise and economic growth. So the resource windfall to these municipalities is an important source of resources. So these are poor municipalities that receive these windfalls, and they have a very low ability or capacity to collect taxes, around 20% on average. The canon law redistributes 50% of the natural resources from the central government to both extractive and non-extractive districts, according to a very specific rule that I will discuss in the next slide. And then that is redistributed around the different municipalities. And that constitutes around 20% of the budget. So it's a sizable amount of money that these poor municipalities are getting. And these, as I said earlier, are ring-fenced for public infrastructure projects with the idea to help backward areas to close these developmental gaps between richer areas like Lima and these more rural areas in most cases. So this is because we are only focusing on non-extractive municipality. This is a quasi-random variation in resource windfalls that will depend on two things. On the redistribution rule that is fixed and doesn't change over time, and use parameters that were fixed before and never change in a study period. But also, of course, by shocks, right? In 2006, it was early stages of an increase in extraction and export of minerals from Peru. That peaked around 2012, 2013, and then it started going down. So that affected, of course, international prices, and those prices, of course, affected the amount of royalties that these companies were paying, and that affected the budget that municipalities were getting, right? And the idea, and that's why we focus in non-extractive municipalities, is that if we focus on extractive, we will be conflating what's going on with the extractive activity and this redistribution instrument. So we focus only in non-extractive municipalities that are quite far from where the extractive activity happens, so that there's no spillovers, economic spillovers from this activity. So everything we're identifying will go through this change in public budgets. So this is a redistribution rule that was fixed in 2006. 10% goes to extractive municipalities, 25% to all municipalities located in the province where the extraction happens. So a province is a collection of municipalities. And then 40% goes to all municipalities in the region. A region is a collection of provinces, right? So you may receive money either because you extract or because you're in the same province as another municipality that extracts, or because you're in the same region but not in the same province as a municipality that extracts. Then with that, we have 25 regions, almost 200 provinces, more than 1,800 districts, and 2 and 3 are the key element for our exercise. So this is Peru. The main source of these royalties is the mining activity. You can see all the blue dots are mines. And you can see, or maybe not, but there's the districts there. So you can see here, for example, these districts here, they have no extractive activity, so their canon will be 0. This district here is neighboring. It's almost the same as the other one in the other region, but because in the south of the region there's one extractive activity, they will get money, right? So we're comparing virtually two municipalities that look exactly the same, but one happens to be inside the boundaries of a region that has a mine like 500 kilometers away, and for that reason, my municipality receives funds, while the neighboring municipality receives nothing, right? And this is basically the main idea behind the identification, and as you can see, due to all the blue dots in the map, this happens almost everywhere, right? So places here will receive much more than places here or that here and so on. And this is just a simple graph to show that the canon, which is this one here, follow pretty much the cycle of commodities, right? That peak around in around 2012-13. So prices of minerals went up and then went down, and so did the canon. So as you can see, what I'm pointing towards here is that we're going to have a lot of both regional and time variation in terms of the resources that these different municipalities receive. And this is to show why it doesn't matter how close you are to extractive activities. This is what the extractive municipalities get, which is a lot, because that's where the activity happens. But we exclude all these municipalities from the sample. Then we go to municipalities in provinces, and you can see that it doesn't matter whether you're far or close to the extractive activity. They pretty much receive the same on average. And even less, the municipalities that are in the same region, but not in the same province. And again, distance to extraction doesn't seem to matter. So here again, it shows that we will have a lot of, so the red ones will receive less than the blue ones, even though they're in the same region, but in different provinces, right? And none of them have any extractive activity. So this is very simple. We run an IV where we instrument the total budget of municipalities by using the variation in the canon received by each of these municipalities. And then it's all standard. We have errors cluster at district level. We have a time and district fixed effects. We have a lot of controls and so on. So what's important is that you believe me that everything I will tell you, all my results, will be driven by these transfers and these resource windfalls and not by the presence of mining activity nearby. So we try to address that, and that's the key aspect of our exclusion and restriction of what makes our strategy work. So we can try to address that directly by controlling for the production value of the closest mining activity, or by checking whether the point estimates are different according to distance to different mines. We have a specification using boundary and fixed effects, which is a bit like the story I just told you in the map. We have a boundary that separates two provinces or two regions, and that boundary, of course, the economic circumstances of both municipalities are the same, but one happens to be inside the province, the other happens to be outside, and then that generates this continuity in how much royalties they get, and then that generates some additional variation. We try doing that. We control for time-varying fixed effects that happen at the province or at the regional level. We control for poverty levels at the beginning of the period, because poverty was a driver of some of the redistribution rules. We exclude large municipalities in case there's some commuting going on. And then for some subset of the data we can see a small number of households and individuals over time, and they form a panel. And we can run everything using household and individual fixed effects for that reduced sample. And what we find is that the results are robust. And basically what it means is that my individual circumstances change over time with the canon, right? Me, Juan Pablo. It's not me comparing to someone that's similar. So when we do that, the effects all hold. So hopefully now I convince you that the exercise I'm going to do is clean enough to try to understand what's going on. Yeah? Try to see whether this redistribution of resource rents can actually have a meaningful economic effect in local economies. The data, we have municipality administrative data, panel data for 1,500 municipalities. We have revenue and expenditures. We have type of expenditures. We have how they hire people, skill, type of contract. We have some data on the public works that they start and that they finish. We have individual data from the household survey, the ENAO. It's a repeated cross-section. So we have 700,000 individuals in our non-extractive municipalities and a panel for 260,000 households. We have 1,300 municipalities. We have labor market participation, earnings, income, consumption, and other socio-demographics. Then we have a micro-enterprise survey that has agricultural and non-agricultural operations. And we have some measures of performance and productivity. We have, we try to estimate towards the end multiplier effect. And for that, we use some municipality GDP estimates that were done by a group of people in Peru. And we use that to estimate the multiplier effects. Then, as I said, we were controlling for mine. We have mining activity for 13 minerals, geolocation of the activities, international prices, and then we have some poverty measures that were obtained from the 2005 census. So maybe I should clarify that the household survey, this one, also gives us some measures of poverty. But the census, of course, gives us a more complete picture of what happened before the period. So I have 18 minutes, so I will summarize the main results here, and then I will go through them more in detail. But I think we're doing okay with time. So the first one is that the canon, this redistribution, increases the size and the composition of public sector expenditure, right? So this redistribution is not being wasted, it's not being lost, it's being spent. It's being spent in capital projects, and it's being spent in hiring some people, but it's not the main expenditure. So local governments, so basically the intention or the first step of the policy, whose intention was to change the size and composition of public sector budgets at the municipal level, that happens, and we have evidence that that happens. And local governments use these windfalls to hire staff and to procure local goods and services for infrastructure projects. When we move to local labor markets, we find that people are working more. And it's not just that people are working more, it's that better quality jobs are being generated, right? So what happens is we can think of it as a ladder, right? A lot of people are taken out of inactivity and drawn into productive activities, even though those productive activities in many cases are unpaid, right? If you work for your family business, you're not being paid, but now you're working before you were not, now you're engaged in productive activities. But also we observe that wage employment, which is a measure of the quality of job in low-income economies, is also increasing. And I say that because a lot of the economic activity in low-income areas, not just in Latin America, but around the world, is driven by self-employment activity, right? People just working on self-account. One day I do this, one day I do that. I have something in the corner, and then I try to sell. Well, if you walk around, you can see it patently. So having a wage job, which is working for someone that pays a job, that pays a wage to you, that's a sign of a better functioning labor market and a higher quality job. We find evidence of that happening. We find that people that work in self-account and have their own micro-enterprises, whether in agricultural and non-agricultural sectors, they increase their revenues and the labor productivity, and they invest more. And why do I stress the agricultural sector so much? Not just because a lot of the backward areas are rural, but also because the agricultural sector is a sector that cannot directly serve the municipality, right? They produce food, and they can sell food. But it's not something that they will sell to municipalities, which could happen with some of the non-agricultural sectors, such as services, transport, any type of services, right? So the interesting thing is that all the effects that we observe in the agricultural sector are suggestive of a multiplier effect, because someone is suddenly consuming more of those products, and it's not a direct effect coming from municipal spending. And finally, rural areas benefit the most from this local demand shock produced by or triggered by these resource windfalls. And we find that the income and the consumption gains and the reduction in poverty is significantly stronger in rural areas than in urban areas, where the effects are much more negligible. So this is the findings in a nutshell. I'm going to show in the remainder of the talk, I'm going to show some of the details of that. The first key finding was related to the first step. Do these non-extractive municipalities that now receive money, do they spend it? Do they spend it as they are supposed to spend it? And what do they do with it, right? And maybe here, let's focus on the panel B that looks at levels. For every dollar that they receive, they spend 97 cents on average, right? I'm struggling with, okay, this is going. Okay, so that's quite one-to-one, right? Which is already good news, because they could receive money and then maybe not do anything with it. 80 cents of those 97 go to capital expenditures. Yes, as the law intended, these municipalities are spending in infrastructure projects. Some of it goes to current, and only a small amount goes to spending in more human resources, right? And then there's an increase in goods and services. So human resources and goods and services may sometimes be overlapping with these capital and current expenditures, because if I'm maintaining a road, I'm hiring workers, and those workers will show as capital expenditure, but they are like, they may also show up as goods and services if I'm contracting out to a local firm that is providing maintenance services, right? But this is the first indication that at least the policy is being spent as it was intended, which I think is an achievement per se. The second set of results related to municipal outcomes is that municipalities seem to be starting more productive and social capital projects. By productive, we mean irrigation, transportation, telecoms, housing, water and sanitation, which in Peru you have water is very locally provided, energy and other physical large-scale infrastructures and so on. Social capital includes culture centers or recreation centers, security, stuff like that. And as you can see, the point estimate is much larger for productive investments. And if you see here, the mean average productive project that is started is 0.6. So on average, municipalities start less than one project. This is pretty much 4 times that, right? 3.5 times that, right? So this is going towards productive projects that are started, and to some extent to some social capital projects as well, but to a lower extent. The interesting thing is that the rate at which these projects are completed or finished is much lower. So things start, but not necessarily finish. In any case, the point estimates are 10 times the mean, right? So even though they're not significant, the point estimates suggest that even though we cannot say that they are statistically significant from each other, it shows that on average they do conclude more projects. So that's the first set of findings. The second set of findings, what happens with labor markets in those local municipalities? More people are employed. More people are employed in the private sector, even though the public also goes up. More people are employed in the private sector. And that might be that they are selling goods and services to the public sector, right? Doesn't mean that they don't sell to the public sector, but they are in private activities, not directly contracted by the public sector. And then we find that informality drops a bit and that earnings go up, right? So as I said earlier, one of our identification constraints was that whether some of these effects may be driven by mining activities that may be hiring people, maybe contracting people or services and so on. And what we find is that the point estimates are, if anything, larger the further away from the mines rather than closer to the mines. So whether in employment or in earnings, we don't find any evidence that the extractive activity in itself could be generating these effects. And the fact that the point estimates are a bit larger in places further away is consistent with these other results I told you about in terms of rural areas benefiting more. So all industries benefit, all sectors, even those that are not supposed to directly sell anything to the municipality. Services may, and manufacturing or construction activities may, but agriculture most likely not. And the employment and the earnings go up across the board, right? So this is, again, an evidence that some economic activity is being triggered and is not just a first-order effect, but there are secondary effects that are consistent with the multiplier effect. And then, as I was saying earlier, so there's little evidence of, or evidence of some small increase in entrepreneurship, more employers, but stronger evidence of people having higher quality jobs, wages, working for wages, an increase in self-employment. But as I was saying earlier, an increase in unpaid work, right? And that's where the largest increase happens. And as I was saying, this is all relative to inactivity. So people in areas that receive more windfalls are being taken out of inactivity and start being employed in productive activities, right? Which is a symptom of labor markets improving and getting more dynamic. Key finding 3, microenterprises. We find that the revenues go up, whether it's non-agricultural, non-agricultural, and that is true for all, but also for the enterprises that are household run only. They don't employ anyone. They do all the work themselves. And whether it's non-agricultural or the agricultural sector, the revenues of those households goes up in this way. And then the revenue per worker, which is a measure, an imperfect measure of productivity, it's a measure of revenue productivity, that goes up as well. And what's interesting is towards the end, we find that these non-agricultural enterprises are more likely to start investing in business premises and owning those premises. And the farmers are starting to expand their agricultural operations, their own land is going up. So they're purchasing more land. And finally, I'm doing okay with time. Finally, rural areas benefit the most from this local demand shock. And this is, it's a nice picture if you have it in front of you. Here we have these for urban, peri-urban, and rural households. And here we have the point estimates. And you can see this progression, right? Urban, peri-urban, rural. And that's the probability of being employed. And as you can see in rural areas, remember the point estimate was 0.06. In rural areas, it goes up to 0.26. So we do this with most of all these labor market outcomes. Let me say something, for example, for the private, being employed in the private sector, also much higher in rural areas. Earnings, much higher in rural areas. And then unpaid work, also much larger in rural areas, right? So all this dynamism, all these increased economic activities seem to be happening mostly in rural areas. And remember that that was the purpose of the redistribution rule, right? Try to help backward areas to catch up with more developed areas. So when we focus on rural areas, the income goes up, consumption in food, in non-tradables such as rent, like the price paid for accommodation. So income and consumption both go up, and then a measure of poverty that is calculated by the INEGI, the statistical agency, goes down substantially, right? 11 percentage points. So the next step, or the next thing is that all this suggests that the effects happen and they are not direct, there are indirect effects going on. So we use these municipal estimates of GDP to estimate the multiplier effect and how it changes over time. And what we find is something around 1 that it's increasing over time, right? So basically we have some suggestive evidence that there's some ongoing, sustained economic activity a few years after the shocks. So one of the questions is why or how, what could explain these transitions that we observe, and why could we have a multiplier effect without having inflationary process, for example, right? Something that I didn't mention is that we look at local prices, look at food prices, and we don't observe anything clear in the prices that consumers pay. So how can you get, I mean, remember what I said earlier, I come from Argentina. Printing money and sending money to places is inflationary, right? It generates a lot of inflation. It doesn't generate economic activity. But why is a similar process, which is just a windfall distributed to these poor areas, is generating some real effects, not just nominal changes? And we think that this is related to the economy having a lot of slack, basically a lot of productive resources that are not being used, that as soon as things start moving, then it's very easy and costless to bring those resources into economic activity, whether it's land, whether it's labor, whether it's capital, and all this supported by no evidence that consumer food prices, which are tradable, are increasing at all, right? We have some slight evidence that some non-tradables go up, which is what you would expect, but that doesn't stop the real effects to be realized. So, to conclude, right on time, 30 seconds left. So, these resource rents are earmarked for public investment and are distributed through local governments. And we find some evidence that this may improve local economic conditions. It increases municipality expenditures, and it seems to be triggering some ongoing economic activity. We see, oh, I don't know what I did, but can you put it full screen again? Yeah. So thanks, gracias. Labor demand shock increases labor market outcomes. The spillovers into industries that are unrelated to public works and that do not serve the municipality directly. We find that small operational units, whether agricultural or non-agricultural, household firms, seem to be doing better, and that these effects are mostly observed in rural economies. So all this looks very nice. Of course, one question is what would happen if you pull the plug and you take away this transfer of resources? Well, so we did find some evidence that some years after the increase in municipal transfers, some of the effects persist. But what we think is that this may not be enough unless you're generating self-sustained economic activity, right? If you are only depending on these transfers, then once you take them out, because there's a downward trend in mineral prices, for example, then all these effects may disappear. So that's a word of caution in terms of not interpreting this like this is generating a self-sustained economic growth process that will bring all of Peru up to higher levels. But it seems to be an effective way of using the resource rents to try to improve regional economies and local livelihoods. And I think with that, I will finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan Pablo, for that insightful presentation. We have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience. I think there will be 2 microphones if our assistants can help us. I think I can leave you, Juan Pablo, to manage the questions. Is that okay? Given that we don't have an extra mic here.
I can't see much, but if you decide who asks the questions, and then I don't know.
I have a mic, so I'll start. How about that? So I think your results suggest that Peru could do better by pulling all the revenues back in nationally and redistributing them to the most rural municipalities, as opposed to doing this by regional jurisdiction. And so I'm curious if you agree with that, right? You see the highest impacts of the transfers in the most rural municipalities, so why not just look nationally and send it out to the most rural municipalities? And then second, what's the administrative or political reason for the canon functioning like it does?
Thanks. Should I can go one by one, otherwise I'll forget. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not saying that there's no alternative, more efficient way of doing this. I'm just documented that something that was implemented, at least it wasn't a complete disaster, right? So that brings us to, it's an age-old debate about decentralization versus centralization of resources. And I guess we would all agree that some increasing returns, high capital investments, such as maybe energy networks and all that, are better than centrally. But some of them are not. So the water system, for example, in Peru is very decentralized, and I think it's run reasonably well. Maybe someone may know better than me. But what I would say is that, yeah, so I wouldn't take a stance on whether centralized government with full information and no inefficiencies and all the best intentions in the world, whether they could do this better. Yes. Do I know a government that works like that? No. At least not in our region. Sorry, and the other one was? Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. So in one of our specifications, we constrained the sample to municipalities on each side of the border. And we compare. And because those tend to be more rural, our point estimates are much larger there. So the difference between those two, that's exactly what's going on. Yeah.
It's the question of sort of the political motivation for that, or is it just an administrative motivation?
Do you have any Peruvian in the audience? I really don't know. I missed that debate, but maybe I should know better. So I will read up on that.
Okay. Thanks for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. On the mechanism for some of these impacts, particularly on the multiplier, you were mentioning slack in the local economies. Can you distinguish between, is this incredibly loud? Or is it just me?
No, it's
all right, okay.
They're very softly spoken.
Okay. Can you distinguish between, so the idea of slack suggests sort of, resources idly lying around which suddenly get deployed because there's a bit of cash coming through the economy. But then what this cash might be doing is relaxing things like credit constraints. There may be some credit rationing going on, and this money provides some, investment capital which couldn't have been, which overcomes those constraints, basically. Are you able to kind of distinguish between the types of slack that there might be?
So we're still working through that, because it's the data doesn't allow us to get into. So we need to put together disparate data sets with different sources, so we cannot clearly match the location for a very specific project to where the effects are found and all that. So that's a limitation of what the data offers. But the slack is there, basically. So if you look at any, if you look at the agricultural module, for example, you will see that 40% of the land is unused, right? So the 40% of the land that farmers have is left, and it's not left for investment purposes. It's not left to fallow, for example. It's just left unoperated. They don't have the working force. They don't have the incentives. It's mostly self-consumption. Markets are not integrated. So there's a lot of things that are missing there that are not incentivizing people to use those resources. And what we find here is that as soon as these labor markets get a bit more dynamic, the largest effect is from people that stop being inactive and start declaring that they work for the family farm or the family business and all that. So market integration, particularly in all the highlands, which is basically, it's easier to get to a neighboring village by going down to the coast, doing 10 kilometers and going up, than by going across. So this lack of market integration that we cannot document really well, I think it's at the heart of this as well. Hi.
Hello?
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Two questions. The first one, if you see an increase in land, does it mean that deforestation increased because of the policy? And the second question is, you mentioned that we're displacing a lot of coal workers because of the transition, but you will say that we also can do more mining. Can we transfer the coal miners to do lithium mining, or also technically, do they have the skills, and also geographically? Is there a coal mine next to a lithium mine so we can just keep the same house, or they will need to migrate?
Thanks. Let me start for the last one. So there's an issue of geographical location of the resources, which is you would need to mobilize people. Sometimes in low-income countries, that mobilization is not, you would expect the market or incentive to operate in that way, and it doesn't happen. What I would say is that most of this modern mining that is coming is capital intensive, and the type of skills that they require tend to be very different, right? So I was in a mine in Ghana, and even the security in the compound around the mine was being brought from 300 kilometers away. So what I would say is that some of these skills lack a lot of transferability, and all the evidence in the UK, in Germany, some of it in Poland, I think, shows that this transformation is really, really hard. So I think you need to look after those displaced miners, but you would need to do it in a different way. Yeah. And the other, sorry, what's the first one? Deforestation. A lot of this, so we need to define forestation first, right? So these are maybe small bushes and stuff like that that may be taken out. So if you consider that part of the stock of forest or of the green stock, then maybe yes, but these effects are not huge to be that concerned about. So I don't think these are very small effects. In the operational unit is on average less than 3 acres, right? So this is very, very small, mostly. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you. In the beginning, you mentioned that in Argentina, throwing money at municipalities does not generate economic growth, but apparently in Peru it does. And so thinking about what is the difference between these two contexts, have you thought about the restrictions that I believe you talked about that were placed on how the municipalities were able to use the money could have something to do with that? That, for example, maybe we're seeing these effects because the municipalities were only allowed to spend on capital and not, for example, to hire the mayor's best friends in public office?
Yeah, thanks. So the last part of your question, that's correct, right? It was earmarked for this type of expenditures. We may be surprised that they still do it, right? It's not that rules have prevented anyone from doing other things. But for the other thing, maybe I will speculate a bit, so I cannot give you a direct answer. But places like Argentina, 95% urban, right? So Peru, particularly these poor municipalities, the rural population is much larger. And in Argentina, the political economy of these redistributions is much more centralized. You don't get redistribution to municipalities, you get resources going to what would be a province government or regional government. And the political economy there is quite clear, the benefits that the public employees get, and it's a circle, it's a vicious circle that it's really hard to break down, because all these things we prevent the actually investment in the private sector, because there's no workers basically that are willing to go and work in a farm for lower wages, in a firm or a farming for lower wages and all that. I think those dynamics don't happen as much in Peru, and that's why I would say, so the nature of the transfers are different, the rules are different, but also the geography or the urbanization and the distribution of the population are different as well. And I think that may explain part of it. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, for this first keynote speech. We want to invite all of you to the 5th floor, where we will have the coffee break, please, and then you can see the rooms for the parallel sessions. We need to make a bit shorter the coffee break, just to get the original schedule.